All right. Hello and welcome to the lecture on World War One. This is the first one I've done in a while. The story behind that basically is that I ran the poll to see how many people actually thought these were going to be helpful to them. And when I ran that poll the first week, I only had maybe about 4 people who responded. They all said it would be helpful, but out of a class this size, that wasn't large. But then I got a lot of people who were answering and putting in those responses later. So by the time it was all done, pretty much the whole class said that these were helpful. And so I'm picking back up with basically where we are now, which gets us to World War One. And here we go. Again, these PowerPoints, by the way, are from one of our old textbooks. They are not necessarily going to correspond with the chapter numbers to what we're doing now. They should be pretty close, but not exactly. And you can get these if you want them. If you want to use them, you can just let me know, and I'll either, if there's enough demand, just put them in the references link area, or I can just, 1 or 2 people, I can just send them to you. And you don't have to have them all. You're like, maybe I want to see one on like this, World War One, but you don't care about the rest. Just let me know. All right. All right. This is an important one for us because this is really the first time we're really getting involved directly with stuff that's going on mostly in Europe. All right. It's a huge transition for us, and it's, to be honest, inevitable. Now, this is going to be a huge war. Many people would call this the first modern war. There's a number of wars that get that designation. Some people about the wars of Napoleon is the first modern war, and some is it's our Civil War. This is a bloody war, and it is similar in some respects to our Civil War, in that the technology had progressed in making weapons, and the strategy had not. So I was actually just listening to a history podcast the other day about how Robert E. Lee was really not that great of a general, and I was glad to hear it because I actually agreed with him. There was not a general in the Civil War that was a brilliant guy, because what makes a person a brilliant leader is that they see what they've got and they adapt. Like Napoleon did when they made such great improvements, particularly in artillery. He adapted that and sculpted his strategy around that. We still fought in the Civil War like we did with muskets, that you couldn't hit someone standing right in front of you from 10 feet away, which was you pop off a few rounds and then you run at the guy and try to stab him with the bayonet or club him with the rifle. And when we fought the Civil War, you had the rifles literally at that point that could hit a person from half a mile away. So all we got a bunch of people dying needlessly. We did not take tactics and change those to use that technology. Instead, we got more people killed because we didn't have a single leader anywhere who understood how to use that technology. World War One is the same way for the European perspective. It's worse because by this time they've developed machine guns, and artillery can hit from 20 miles away. We're going to see poison gas used by both sides, and they're still digging trenches, and then you fire off a few rounds and you get up and you run straight towards that machine gun. And so now, instead of like in our war, a couple million getting killed, World War One, we see somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 million people getting killed, right, on the battlefield, not counting other casualties, civilians, for example. Well, this war, why does this happen? Well, they're number one. There had been Napoleon back in 1815, finally defeated at Waterloo. Europe had tried to create a system that maintained the peace so that nobody like that would come up and engulf all of Europe in a war that lasted 15 years again. Right? So what they came up with was basically a balance of power. And there were 5 great states, 5 great powers. England, France was recognized as one of them. There was no Germany, right? It was Prussia, and Austria, both German countries, right? And then there was Russia as the fifth. Now, over the course of time, the balance of power had to be maintained. The thought was that nobody would launch into a war because the potential, like say Germany taking over all of Russia, would make them so strong that everybody else would gang up on them to prevent that from happening, and you'd basically beat them down before it could escalate. Well, that worked great, except for a few things. One of which was that Germany came into existence, and Prussia basically fought some minor wars with its neighbors, fought one with Austria. Basically, that Germany, the German people, the people who spoke German and had that culture, were trying to unite into a single country under what's a philosophy called nationalism, a tendency really more than philosophy, but the idea that everybody who belongs to a culture should belong to the same nation. It should be Germans should be governed by Germans, Austrians by Austrians, etc., Russians by Russians. Well, Austria was also Germany. Now, they had a very multicultural empire, most of which was not German, but Austria itself was German. Prussia and Austria fought a war, and basically that determined, because Prussia won, that Prussia was going to be the one to get Germany to its unification. They had to fight a few other wars to get some of the German states from other countries like Denmark, and then really the worst one, though the most important, was France. They defeated France in about 7 weeks, embarrassed what was supposed to be the strongest military on the continent, and forced them to give up a stretch of territory called Alsace-Lorraine that was, long time had been controlled by France. The people there was like right on the border, and half the people were French, half were German. Culturally, you couldn't look at it and say it belonged to either one, really. But it was an embarrassment to France, and they harbored resentment, and they were looking for revenge. Right now, this is exacerbated by changes in technology. There's a lot of competition, right, for markets to sell your goods, and also because you need stuff to make those goods from, there's also a lot of competition for getting access to raw materials. So Europe had basically divided up the rest of the non-European world in Africa and much of Asia and made colonies out of it. And virtually all of Africa was a colony of France, Great Britain, or one of the other European powers. France had Southeast Asia, what's now Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. All of them had a presence in China, but it was all to get both, raw materials cheaply, bring them home, manufacture something, and then sell it back to those people that they colonized too. Right? Well, basically, there was an arms buildup, particularly a naval buildup between Britain and Germany, and then there was an arms buildup again. France was looking for an opportunity to beat Germany again anyway, and of course that was an arms buildup. Now, on the face of it, it looked like there was a lot of international cooperation. You can see there were agreements on telegraphs, postage, copyrights, even had the World Court established at the end of the 1800s. But at the same time, you've got this wave of nationalism, and that works. We look at it today like it's a bad thing. It's not necessarily in itself good or bad, but it depends on how it plays out. In the Austrian Empire, what was happening was that you had a lot of people who are referred to as Slavic people. These are not one group, but they are related, and they represent what's now several different countries. Come from the same ethnicity as Russians do. Russian people are Slavic as well as are many of the groups in Eastern Europe. Well, these people felt conquered, and what nationalism meant for them was that they wanted their independence so they could rule their own affairs and establish a country such as, say, Serbia, or what we see on the map today, all those little states, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Albania, and so on and so forth. Well, at the same time, in the East, you've got a rivalry between Russia and Austria. Russia plays off of that, and they're getting support in sowing dissension amongst Slavic people in the empire so that they can chip away and take territory away from Austria. Well, basically, the other thing is that they've maintained this peace by a system of alliances and the threat of war. So, what the guy who unified Germany under Prussia had done was to create a system that ensured France would not attack him by having an alliance with Austria and with Russia. Well, when Bismarck was gone, Wilhelm II, the emperor, is basically the one in charge of Germany at the start of this war, lets the treaty with Russia lapse, and now they sign a treaty with France, and Germany and Austria have a treaty. They do bring in Italy, but basically what happens is a lot of these treaties are secret. Nobody knows the terms. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And we see at the last here that you got the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary basically being assassinated by Serbians who are promoting independence. Serbia has its independence. They're promoting independence for other Serbian people who are still part of the empire. Right? Austria decides to punish Serbia. They list a bunch of demands that they tell them to meet. They meet all but one of them, but they use that as an excuse to invade Serbia. Just so happens, Serbia has a secret treaty that calls for Russia to declare war in defense of Serbia. So Russia declares war on Austria. Now Austria and Prussia, or now Germany, have a treaty in place. It's not that big of a secret. Kind of everybody knows about that one. But when Russia declares war on Austria, it obligates Germany to declare war on Russia. Yeah. Secret provision again. And again, a lot of this isn't all that secret. Espionage, spying, they probably know most of this stuff. But there's a treaty between France and Russia. So when Germany declares war on Russia, now France is obligated and goes ahead and declares war on Germany. So now everybody except Britain is fighting, right? And Italy. Italy has a treaty with Germany that, they're supposed to jump in on the German side. They're the only ones that don't do what their treaty says to do. They actually end up joining the other side. They say, forget you, Germany, and sign up and join the Allies. Great Britain is sitting out on the field and just trying to stay neutral at this point in time. And what happens is that there is this plan of attack that basically calls for the Germans to just go around the French fortifications and come in and attack Paris. The only problem with it is that it goes through a neutral country, Belgium, which is a violation of international law, and it's considered a threat by particularly nations close by. And that's what gets Britain off the fence, and they declare war on Germany. Now that plan almost worked, and if it wasn't for Great Britain, France would have surrendered and this war would have been over. But with that action, drawing Great Britain in, Great Britain comes in, and now basically the Germans are getting hit on their flank at the same time they're trying to hit the French on their flank. That basically ends up everybody digging trenches, and then we're fighting in trench warfare from 1914 all the way up to 1918. All right. A lot of countries do neutral. Some of the countries stay neutral at first but jump in later. We're going to have two sides on this, just like World War II. The side that we are on, France is on, and Great Britain is on, that is the Allies. And then if you know World War II, you got the Axis powers on the other side. Well, different ones. And this time, the group is called the Central Powers, not the Axis. So in World War I, it's the Allies and the Central Powers. In World War II, it's going to be the Allies and the Axis. And they are not the same ones, all right? Some of them are, all right? Obviously, the Allies consist of Germany, Great Britain, eventually us, and Russia in both wars, all right? But Japan is an ally in World War I, and they flip sides. They're part of the Axis in World War II, and so does Italy. They're an ally in one, but an Axis member in two, all right? At the beginning, it is Germany and Austria-Hungary, but later the Ottomans come in the next year, and the year after that, Bulgaria comes in as well, both joining the Central Powers. Right. Japan is basically only operating in the Pacific, and they're basically taking away some of the islands that the Germans had taken possession of. Not much fighting. They're really a small player in this. Italy is a smaller country, but they're heavily involved, opening up a front against the Allies. And both of those were promised stuff after the war. Both of those, one of the things that drives them towards the Axis is the promises made. We did not live up to them at the end of the war. Right? We, of course, try to stay neutral, and we do almost until the end. And we come in and basically flip the scales towards the end, break the deadlock between the Allies and the Central Powers. All right, now this was truly a world war. It was mostly fought in Europe, but all these countries, as you can see, that had been colonized, you had troops coming from all the African territories, Australia, India, Indonesia, troops from all over the world being brought back to Europe and put into uniform fighting for, whichever country they were colonized by. You saw some of it spread over into the Middle East, even though there weren't formal declarations of war. The Arab tribes were basically being supported by the British to basically have a revolution and break off from the Ottoman Empire. So you basically had fighting almost everywhere. With the naval fighting, it could occur everywhere and off the coast of every continent, right? And not quite as full scale as World War II would be, but it was big enough. You had fighting in Asia, obviously with Japan, but again, it was smaller scale there. Right? What we were seeing at home, well, we've gone through that. If you remember, we're going through that progressive movement, and many of these people were worried that if we got involved in this war, all of our efforts would be focused on winning the war, and all these reform movements would just dry up because nobody cares about them because they're going to distract us from the war effort. Right? A lot of Americans wanted this war to end, and we tried to mediate a neutral party, and obviously never worked. Others wanted to go in and join in, and Teddy Roosevelt was an example of this. He wanted us to join in as a country, and he wanted to go over there and fight himself. The realities of this war, though, was that it was a very ugly one. The Battle of the Marne basically was a stopped German advance. We ended up with that trench warfare. If you look at the casualties there, you can see well over 1 million people just at the Battle of the Somme. All right, again, 20 million casualties, and that's probably undercounted. So, some of these countries, we don't have accurate counts of how many people they lost. And Russia was the one who lost the most, Germany the second most, by the way. All right, a lot of this is because we just ran straight at the other guy and tried to bash him with a rifle. You got a machine gun that can hit you from 3,000 feet away, and you can just shoot down 100 people in like 5 seconds. That is why you have so many casualties here. There is no attempt to kind of capitalize on movement or flanking or other technologies it can use until towards the end of the war. The tank is really going to be what breaks the stalemate. It can get across what they call no man's land, the land between your trenches and their trenches, and that's really going to be the difference maker. And it takes so long because they actually came up with it pretty early and put it in the field before it was perfected, and it kept breaking down, and everybody said this is a piece of junk, and they went away from it. And it turned out to be what actually was decisive, though, towards the end. A lot of other things, the rifles fire more accurately and quicker than they could before. The artillery, again, much improved. You can hit from sometimes 20, 25 miles away, and you can do so with all kinds of different effects. You can set those shells to like burrow into the ground and blow up once they're in there. You can set them more dangerously to blow up at a certain altitude, and so it basically blows up over your head and just rains shrapnel down on everybody. Flamethrowers were used for the first time. Poison gas was used first by the Germans, but everybody picked it up. And the defense to that, the gas mask, was also developed during this war. And all of that just basically contributed to those huge casualties, and there was never any real brilliant leader who was able to capitalize on these technologies and figure out how to use them to avoid all those they're still just, like I said, they're still using 1700s American Revolution tactics, running at the guy and getting shot down, hoping somebody gets over there and you got enough people make it to, kill a few of the enemy, right? A lot of other technologies, not necessarily on the battlefield, but aiding the war effort. Airplanes would be in that. We did, as it says, drop bombs, but they couldn't carry a lot then, so there wasn't really militarily strategic. What really important for was reconnaissance, spotting where your enemies were, what their movements were, that kind of stuff, right? And then our increase in communications, being able to use the radio, telephones, all of those things, being able to use trucks and move people faster. All of that was used on the logistical side very effectively. But again, the battlefield tactic never was all that great. All right. As early as 1913, you can see that Teddy Roosevelt was trying to get people prepared for war. Keep in mind, this was not in anticipation when he started it of World War I, because it would still be another year before it started. Right. All right. Here you can see, the size, but this is the problems that we had as neutral parties. Right. President Wilson wants us to stay neutral and be out of the war. And at home, though, remember, we've had a lot of immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We've got about 8 million people from Germany and Austria who naturally are inclined to support their side of the war. Whereas we also have a lot of Italian immigrants. That was our second largest single immigrant group, behind the Irish, and those Italians tend to support their country of origin, or their parents' country of origin, which was Italy, which is on the Allied side. So you see a sharp division of Americans are not just wanting to support the British and the French on the Allied side. There's a lot of people who want to support the other side because that's where they trace their roots. The Irish, part of the British Empire, but they are agitating for their independence. Great Britain is heavily suppressing efforts at that in Ireland, very brutal, and a lot of the Irish Americans, and a lot of the Irish, for that matter, don't support Great Britain, and they would also be lining up on the the Central Powers side, or at least wanting to not care about Britain and not support them. So neutral to opposed. So basically, the two largest immigrant groups are the Irish and the Italians, and they tend to support the Germans and Austrians. And then you've got the Italians, as recent immigrants, tended to support the Allies. And then the people who've been here since, before those waves of immigration, and their families that came over, tend to support the Allied side. So you've got some sharp divisions. I mean, it'd be hard to go into a war because you just don't know what's going to happen in your own country, whether your population is going to end up with maybe not a civil war, but riots in the street. Right. The war was billed as the war to make the world safe for democracy, and it had the other great democratic powers, France and Great Britain, on the Allied side, but you had the most repressive monarchy in the Russians on the Allied side too. So it was really not as clear cut in that regard as it appears. The Germans did have a monarchy. They did have less democratic influence, but they had some representation, and they were viewed by many people as the cultural paragon in European society. That's where all the top Europeans who were professors came from. This was the days, of course, going back to like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. All those universities were the top universities in the world at that point in time. Even some of the up-and-comers, not a big name yet. Einstein, of course, coming from those German universities too. So there's it's not like World War II. It's not like we got these Nazis who are just, killing every Jewish person, every, minority person that they can find and are just pure evil. There's a lot more dispute. And if you look at this gets started in some way. You could argue it was the other side that started. There's the Allies that started. Who was right or wrong is very questionable, right? At least at the start of the war, right? Now, the other thing was what we wanted to define as neutrality was basically we're going to be able to sell stuff to both sides. And of course, both sides want to stop supplies from getting to their enemy. So that puts us in a kind of vulnerable position. And that, of course, is something like if, you go back to the Civil War, we put in a boycott. We were not going to let anybody trade with the South. If we did, we'd shoot their ship out of the water. Now we're expecting to go over and sell goods to the British. And for some reason, we think the Germans are not going to shoot us out of the water. So there is a huge double standard on this neutrality debate. We never, live up to it. We do what's in our best interest, which is actually what we're supposed to do in foreign policy. So it's not saying like that double standard is not necessarily particularly evil by itself either, or hypocritical. That's what every country does. You look out for your own best interests. If two sides are fighting, that means you want to sell to both of them, and you complain about getting shut out of the water. But if you're in a fight, then you want to stop supplies, and you're, shooting those other parties who are saying they're neutral. So that is kind of norm. That is the norm. All right. When it says down here, Wilson wanted to keep the U.S. out of the war so he could control the peace. That's very much true. Number one, if we're out of it, we make something of a neutral negotiator. We can arbitrate that. Also, if we are neutral and both parties accept our dictates, we can come up with, the means to create a lasting peace, hopefully. All right. Some things here now. Number one, there were a lot of companies, again, making money off of both sides, including, as you can see, banks were loaning money to both sides in this war. Wilson closes the stock market in July, and he's trying to do some stuff to keep those banks from, over in Europe at those parties from borrowing money from the American banks. Because, again, if we're loaning more money to Britain, then we run the risk of being dragged into it. Right? Germans aren't going to appreciate that, or for a little more Germans, the British aren't going to appreciate it, and that could drag us into the war. Right? We're insisting on those neutral trade rights, and Great Britain had already instituted an illegal blockade. Some of the technology is making this more difficult too. It's again not like the idea in the old days when you put a bunch of ships out and blocked off access to the port city. Now we have the technology of the mines, and so you're, putting those around to make movement perhaps difficult. And what your argument is, well, we want to keep the Navy vessels from getting out of the port, so they blow up when they hit this mine. But it also is going to catch your ships bringing goods in. Right? Wilson actually goes ahead and accepts the British blockade. And what we see from that point forward is a shift. More and more money and goods and so forth is going to the Allies, less and less to the Central Power side. Right? There might be some bias here. We're accepting a British violation of international law, but we do react very harshly to German violations of international law, and we act very harshly towards some things that actually we don't like the Germans doing, but actually are completely legal under international law. Right. All right. As you can see, our declining trade with the Central Powers going from 169 million at the start to just about a million, and then the Allies is growing 825 million to 3 billion. Right. And the government itself is starting to open up those loans again. The way this works and the way this benefits us, it basically makes us the world economic power because of the way we play things. We're loaning money to Europe. Europe only has one place they can spend that money, and that's in our stores, if you will. So we're loaning them $1 million. They're buying $1 million of weapons from us, and then of course they got to pay us that $1 million back. So it's a very effective system for growing our own economy. You see China doing some similar things right now as well. Obviously not in the wars, but in the way they're developing infrastructure. the Germans basically are retaliating to the blockade with one of their new technologies. It's not completely new, but the way it's used is, and that's submarine warfare. Right? Basically, they're able to shoot vessels out of the water, and nobody even knows that submarine is there most of the time. Now, international law does require a warning if you're going to shoot a civilian vessel, a merchant or passenger ship. But the problem with that is that these merchant ships and passenger ships they've got weapons on them. And a submarine is not a heavy, it's not like a battleship that's got heavy guns and is very vulnerable, doesn't have the heavy armor that the battleship does. If you come up, pop up and say, hey, we're about to shoot you out of the water, they just shoot you out of the water. So basically, if you do that, it doesn't work. You have to shoot them out without giving them warning. That's the whole purpose of that type of vessel in the first place. So they start doing that, and that is what we start complaining about. We get a few of our vessels damaged, but we get a lot more of our people killed and if you know the famous Lusitania, it is not a U.S. vessel. That is a British ship. We have a lot of Americans on that ship, right? They're not shooting American ships out of the water without warning. They're shooting British ships out there, but we never thought that maybe, hey, we should ban people from our country from getting on ships that are owned by a country that's fighting another country at the time. Right. Let's see, that Lusitania, as you can see there, in 1915, lost 1,200 people. About 10% of those were American citizens. Right. They argued that this ship was carrying weapons and supplies. As it turns out, of course, the Allies said it was not, but it in fact was. In other words, they were not just Americans getting on a British ship, but it's not like a cruise ship. They were getting on an American citizen getting on a British vessel, going over and fighting, or well, not fighting, but carrying weapons or munitions or supplies for the war effort. Right. So again, this is we made it out to be, we got incensed over this, created a lot of support for the Allies amongst American citizens. But in reality, if you look at it in depth, it's not like the Germans were doing something completely bad, and we shouldn't have had any Americans on there in the first place, so it should have been avoided, right? We gave out a lot of warnings to the Germans. You can see William Jennings Bryan, who was the Secretary of the State, thinks that this is pushing us too close to war and resigns over it, right? But the Germans backed down. They decided to pull back on their blockade and quit shooting those merchant ships out without warning, which actually extends the war. The British were on the point where they were basically about to be starved out because this submarine warfare was so effective, and they let up the pressure on them, and they were able to start, getting supplies back in, and you got a resurgence in their war effort. We don't know. This might have forced very easily, within a year, could have forced the British out of the war. And then would have ended the war probably a lot quicker. Us, forcing the British to give up this submarine warfare, you could look at. There is a strong possibility that we actually cost a few million lives by doing that, and this war would have been done sooner and wrapped up in a completely different way, and World War II gets avoided. Right. All right. At the same time, though, Wilson does start preparing for a war. With some military buildup just in case. He's asking for money to build the army up, putting some money into what will be the Navy as well. And then his going on, and this actually does relate to World War I, but our relations with Latin America. He's trying to set us on a different course there and to improve relations there, to be less the bully amongst Latin American countries. Not completely doing so, but he basically is trying to make sure that Latin America stays stable. The reason why is mostly because we've got a lot of American companies who've got a lot of money invested down there, and chaos, revolutions, that type of stuff threatens those American investments, right? However, in 1913, we signed a treaty with Colombia. We give them $5 million for that whole Panama thing. If you don't know about that or didn't read about that, basically, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to build the Panama Canal where it is, but that Panama did not exist, and Colombia owned it. They would not sell that piece of land to us for the price that we wanted. They would sell it, but they asked more than we wanted to pay. So we got a bunch of people to revolt and create a revolution and separate Panama from them. We funded them, and we even sent our Navy down there to kind of back them up so that the threat would prevent the Colombian military from turning their full force towards these revolutionaries. And we basically stole all that whole country of Panama, and then built our canal. We're giving Colombia, kind of recognizing that was not exactly the right, morally, legally, or any other way to acquire that territory, and offering some compensation. Right. At the same time, we're going down to the Dominican Republic, and we're just basically taking over the government because they're in chaos down there. We actually sent some troops to Haiti and Nicaragua. We're actually keeping Marines in those two countries up to about like 1925, by the way, and very much the core that is going to be the leadership in both the enlisted and officer ranks in World War II is actually cutting their teeth in those regions, right? Mexico, you've got Victoriano Huerta overthrowing Francisco Madero in 1913. Wilson is refusing to recognize that revolutionary government, though, right? Basically, he uses a minor excuse, send some troops down there, and both the Europeans and Latin American countries, not just Mexico, but pretty much all the Latin American countries, see this as a violation of international law. And but basically, we drive Huerta from office, and the whole country collapses into a civil war again, right? Huerta's gone, and now you got Carranza and Pancho Villa basically fighting it out. We are sending weapons to Carranza, and ultimately he wins. But then Pancho Villa starts basically I don't know what you call it, guerrilla type war, attacks a few places in New Mexico, and then we send troops down, and we again violate the border of Mexico, but we're sending troops down there, basically chasing Pancho Villa. General Pershing, who is going to command the forces in World War I for us, is basically the one who's headed up with that task force. Patton, General Patton, if you know his name, most people do, is also going to be cutting his teeth in that chase for Pancho Villa as well. All right. Now, note, most people in America do not want to get in this war. And that's even at the point where we're declaring war and doing it. This was not a popular war at the time. But once we declare war, that changes. It's kind of like nobody wants us to get in, but as soon as we get in, it's not necessarily that they support the war, but you're in it. You say you back your side to win, basically. All right. The election of 1916, right, is played out. Wilson actually telling people he wants to stay neutral, right? He is still trying to lead that progressive movement. You can see appoints Louis D. Brandeis to the Supreme Court, who I believe was our first Jewish person to serve on the Supreme Court. And he was also the attorney that argued many of the cases on the side of progressives, particularly labor cases, labor law cases, I should say, like the restrictions on women's working hours in Oregon. But he's pushing a lot of those progressive reforms, and he's campaigning on the idea that he wants to keep us out of the war in Europe. Republicans nominate Charles Evan Hughes, and he also is calling for neutrality. Both are saying neutrality, but both are also saying we need to be prepared just in case. Does win. It is a close election, but he does win. And from that point forward, his promises of trying to keep us in neutrality, it's not like he breaks them, but things are changing that kind of force him to go into that direction. Right? Wilson is basically drawing up a plan for peace, basically becomes the model for what is going to be his 14 points, which is what he proposes at the actual peace treaty conference. Right? He wants, again, to mediate, but the Germans think that they can actually win this war, and they refuse to sit down and negotiate. And then they start resuming a restricted submarine warfare, which they know is going to get a reaction, negative reaction from Europe, from us, and may push the U.S. into that war on the Allies' side. What they're doing with is they are gambling that they can secure victory before we can get in and prepared and get over here. It's not just to get in and we could declare war, but it's going to take months for us to get an army together and send it over. And they're gambling on the idea that they can win before all that can happen. Then if Britain, France, and all those have surrendered, there's not really going to be much point to us continuing the fight. All right. But that submarine warfare is pushing us towards war. And then we intercept a telegram that's called the Zimmermann telegram. Right? What was in this was basically Germany is telling Mexico, hey, you know, they've been putting all this stuff in your country. You know, you had a revolution, and then they just used a pretense and got rid of your real government. They back in this other side. We don't know who you really wanted. But I'll tell you what, if you jump in and declare war on the U.S. as a country, we'll back you up, and then we will help you get all that territory that you lost to the United States way back in the Mexican-American War. We, of course, take that as a severe interference with our relationship with Mexico, and and it will be a legitimate cause for us declaring war on them on our own. Right now, the same year, and one of the things that's given Germany this kind of hope that they can wrap things up fast is they've been fighting a two-front war this whole time, splitting Russia on the east and then the rest of the allies on the west. They've really had a three-front war because you've got a southern front with Italy, but it is lesser, right? Not as many troops tied up there. Well, they beat Russia, right? Russia has collapsed economically completely, and people just can't keep supporting the war. Their death count is outrageous. Literally, it's bad enough, like I said, that everybody just runs at machine gun nests and hopes to club the guys when they get over there. In Russia, it's even worse. You got like 10 guys, one of them gets a rifle. And they say, you 10 guys run at that machine gun, and you hope one of them gets over there to start beating a guy to death. But basically, one guy with the rifle, your job is to run over there and, get over there and bayonet the Germans. You other guys, your job is to pick up the rifle when that guy dies and gets shot, and then you take over his mission and keep running. And their death count is just, they're higher than anybody else's. They're poorer than anybody else. It drains their resources more. They have a revolution. It is not a communist revolution. The Germans actually foster that. When they have that revolution, you've got a middle-class capitalistic group called the Mensheviks, who are promoting a more, Republican and probably not completely, but somewhat capitalistic system to go in place. The Germans are still worried because with this revolution, it's not a foregone conclusion that Russia is going to drop out. But Lenin is in exile, and what they do is they put him on a train and they ship him over to the border, and then they help sneak him into Russia so that he can go over and lead the Bolsheviks, and we end up with the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks fighting a civil war all the way up till 1922. But the Bolsheviks are able to seize Moscow and officially the government, and then they immediately negotiate a peace and get out of the war with Germany. Now Germany can turn all its attention, free up all those troops. That's why they think they can wipe out the Allies before we can get over there. It just doesn't work out that way. It's the timing that's off. They probably would have won. Again, nothing's ever a foregone conclusion, but they probably would have won after that if we had not jumped in. Right? April 2nd, Wilson goes to Congress for a declaration of war. Right? And he gets that. And then it's not until November of that year that we're really, getting some troops over Right? It takes a long time. We basically don't have a military. Belgium has a bigger army than we do. We've got like a small corps, and we started having to draft people in and build these up and train them. Then we got to ship them over there. And while we're doing that, we got to have equipment for them, weapons, food, uniforms, everything else. Well, we basically turn our whole economy towards the war effort, and the government is directing it. A lot of people think this is a bad outcome because, as you can see, the pacifist people against war, socialists. A lot of people who are not socialists but who are reformers think that this was happening way over Europe, shouldn't be involving us, and it's basically just going to get us to turn our attention away from the thing that is important, which is how we're setting up our own society and government in the country. All right, George Creel heads up what's called the Committee of Public Information, which is basically pure and simple nationalistic propaganda. You see pictures coming off of here, and you look at the Germans, and they're portrayed like big, heavy, frowning, almost guerrillas, and the British and American, the Allied side are uniformed soldiers, trying everything that they can to make the Germans look evil, along with the Austrians, and to make us look like the good guys. Right? Again, this war. Again, it's not like World War II. It's a lot more debatable as to good, bad, whose fault it is, all that stuff in this war than it will be in World War II, where you've got one of the luxuries in that is you've got enemies that they literally are just pure evil. All right. In June, we passed a law called the Espionage Act, and that provides for imprisonment or fine for people who aided the enemy or, and this was the questionable part, caused disloyalty or refusal to do one's duty. Is historically come down as one of our bigger attempts to oppress free speech. And basically, a lot of people were opposed to our entry into the war and said we shouldn't do it. And those people who were still publishing articles like this, well, basically, those guys got arrested and went to jail. So all the voices that say we shouldn't be in this war basically got silenced because of this law. Right? A lot of people were critical of the draft, and the same thing. They end up in jail. Famous case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, Schenck versus the United States, where that famous phrase, "You can't yell fire in a crowded theater," comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our Supreme Court justices there. Probably would not turn out the same way these days. I think we have a little bit more emphasis on free speech in this type of war. Now, if we had a war where we are literally attacked, it might be a different story. I think those factors make a difference. Right. Congress later added a Trading with the Enemy and Sedition Act. So one, again, very vague language, as you can see, prohibited disloyal, profane, scurrilous, and abusive remarks about the form of government, the flag, or the uniform of the U.S. And you could classify almost anything under that was critical of the government's war effort. So it was very, very harsh at the time. It was accepted again because people tend to do that during wartime. In all honesty, during war, we do see usually a retrenchment of some of those civil rights, and usually those restrictions go away as soon as the war is over or very closely afterwards. So, and it's a necessity. I mean, you do have to have a concentrated effort at war. So sometimes some people do say that is justifiable. Sometimes it go too far. This one probably went way farther than it needed to, and was a pretty bad governmental seizure of your individual rights. As you can see, 2,168 people arrested, about half of those convicted. Right. All right, we're in that army again. We had to draft, so you can see June 5th, 9 men between 21 and 31 registered for the draft. We extended that from 21 to 31 and made it 18 to 45. More than 24 million men ended up registering. We got 2.8 million inducted, and about 75% of those ended up serving. All right, your typical soldier at that point in time was 5 foot 7.5 inches tall, weighing 141.5 pounds at 22 years of age. You can see the average person was a lot shorter and a lot lighter than they are today. Most of that is attributed to better nutrition and simply things in the grocery store that you can get that provide nutrients. Fruit, for example, you can get fresh all the time now. You typically had fruit for small windows, and then the rest of the time you ate canned fruit if you had it, which has almost no nutritional value. So, that's over the course of time, refrigeration, better transportation is largely why you're not, well, maybe you are, but why the average person now is male, 6 feet tall instead of 5.7 inches tall, and probably closer to 200 pounds instead of 141 pounds. All right. When you went in, you took a physical exam, an intelligence test, and a psychological test, just like you do now. A majority had not attended high school. The average white soldier had almost 7 years of education, getting you up to about middle of middle school. Less for immigrants, tended to be like, as you can see, almost getting through 5th grade, an elementary level education. For the average Southern African American, not quite 3 years, not quite reaching grade 3. Now, that, of course, is explained for a number of reasons. Segregation, primarily in the South. Immigrants, probably depends on their educational system from where they immigrated from as much as it does on the one over here. Right? 31% were declared illiterate. But again, intelligence tests are always controversial for different reasons about how those tests are made up. But basically, it gives you an idea of what your average soldier was like. Keep in mind, at that point in time, you didn't need algebra for anything unless you're going to be like an engineer or something. The math that you got by 3rd grade included, if it was like it was for me, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, percentages, all the stuff that a normal person would use at that point in time in 90% of the careers available to them. All right. Women were not drafted, but they did contribute to the war effort. They did serve in some roles such as, you see, specific telephone operators, clerk typists. What that did, of course, was that they did not serve on the battlefield, but those were jobs that had to be filled, and they were military personnel. So if the woman could fill that, then that meant that a man who otherwise would be a typist could now go off and be an infantryman. Some did go overseas, and probably the most dangerous role for women was to serve as nurses. Many of those very close to the front lines, and you would see some getting killed out there. All right. There were others who served as volunteers through civilian agencies such as the Red Cross, and then big changes came out of this for many people. I mean, if you were coming from like some town, like one of the little small towns around here, that's probably as much as you ever saw. You might get to Atlanta once a year. You might not get there that frequently. And all you saw was like the 20 people who lived in the same town, the general store, maybe a gas station. And what you ended up with was going all the way over to France and England, London. You probably came through New York, either going out or coming back, maybe both. And you got a much, much broader sense of what the rest of the world was like. You got exposed to new things. It mentions there, particularly the safety razor. Before this, cigarettes were not very popular. Most people smoked pipe or cigar. It was cigarette companies or tobacco companies were giving cigarettes away free and putting them into meals with soldiers, and then people came back and they started buying them. The wristwatch also is one of the things that many soldiers start bringing back home with them, and that popularized them so other people start buying them who did not go over there. All right, your African American soldier, typically African Americans supported the war for a number of reasons. Number one was that they thought it would help overcome prejudice. If you serve the country, you expect the country to, give something back to you. That typically did not happen. In fact, after the war, you saw race riots, oftentimes targeting those returning veterans in much of the whole country. It wasn't just the South. A huge race riot in Chicago, for example, as well. In fact, I think the biggest one was in Chicago. All right. Many times the Southern Draft Boards inducted African Americans so that the white people would not have to go. So if you brought in 50 white, 50 African American draftees, you might get 10 white people drafted, all 50 of the African Americans were going off to serve. And that was, so that, the white people did not have to leave their farms or leave their jobs. On the flip side, there were others who were worried, and they disqualified African Americans more than white soldiers because they feared African Americans getting weapons, learning how to use them, and coming back and expecting more from their society. Right? 1917, this is during the, you see there's one of those riots in Houston, Texas. Black soldiers who'd been harassed by people enforcing segregation laws went out, killed basically 15 whites in that, but more than 100 soldiers ended up court-martialed, 13 condemned to death, hanged before any appeal could be heard. In the South, the government policy was complete segregation. Right? It actually was in the North as well, but in the South there was complete segregation, not just but to abide by and encourage these segregation laws when people went out into the communities around the bases. Marines did not even accept African Americans, and in the Navy, no combat roles, menial jobs, cooks, stewards, that type of thing. As it says, only 6 black nurses went to France, all assigned to black units, right? And overall, did not get the benefits from that service as in terms of progressing civil rights that they hoped for, or anywhere close to it. In fact, in the 1920s, we kind of actually go the other way. You see a resurgence. The Klan comes up as an organization again, and instead of saying, "Oh yeah, but the African Americans served our country, we should do right by them," instead they kind of retrench in rejecting any of the values of any minority group, really. All right. Once over there, United States enters the war in the spring, but it does take a long time to get troops over there. We do start getting some troops and sending them over to France, and we tell them to just, operate under the French. You see, it's October before we actually get any action in. So if you look at the date, we're basically in there for about 1 year, and we come off pretty light here. These other countries have been fighting for 4 years. We don't have anywhere near the casualties that they do, partly because we spend such a short time in there. All right. Pershing insisted that the Americans troop, except for the black units, be segregated from those British and French divisions and serve under the command of American generals. We did by this time have learned our lesson from the Civil War, and we were a little bit more adept at shaping our strategy to fit the technologies. And we did not want to be, having some French guys say, "Run straight at that machine gun. You 50 guys go over there. Maybe one of y'all will make it through." Right? And again, that was actually probably to the benefit of the Allies, because it did mean we probably wrapped up that war quicker than it would otherwise have been. Right? Germany launches an all-out offensive in the spring of 1918 after the winter's over, and comes within 50 miles of Paris before their offense is finally broken, and that basically is the last-ditch effort. We are really, it says here that helps them to time. We are the difference maker. Make no qualm about it. There's a guy who wrote a book maybe about 10 years ago. Points out the fact that many people writing the history of World War II say that we were important, but that this war would have gone on probably for could have gone on as a stalemate almost for probably 10 more years before it finally ends. Make no doubt about it. If we didn't go over there, the Germans would have won then. it would have been over in 1917. Wouldn't even lasted in 1918. We stretched it out longer, propped up those allies, and they would have been beat, plain and simple. We were the ones who came in and we won that war. And it is true. That's not just because we are great. I mean, we have two sides that are basically stalemate and just drawing down each other's resources. We come in there with we're fresh, and we got a huge industrial capacity that basically just tips the scales. Doesn't have anything to necessarily do with us being better soldiers or better fighters. Doesn't have to do with us even having better tactics. We would have won regardless, just because of our industrial capacity we're throwing in at the end with the number of troops we're throwing in. All right. In the fall, British, French, and American troops are basically pushing those Germans back, and there is a mutiny in the German fleet. Austria surrenders, and Germany finally realizes, we have lost. The Kaiser Wilhelm, the emperor, abdicates, gives up the throne, and they sign an armistice on November 11th. That is our Veterans Day. It used to be called Armistice Day. It was there to celebrate the end of World War I. It wasn't technically the end. It was the end of the fighting, but you don't really end it until you sign a peace treaty. That took much longer, but there was no fighting after that, and it ended on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11th, all right, at 11 o'clock. And of course, November is the 11th month, if you didn't catch that one. All right, despite the problems, the war produced a few American heroes. You see Sergeant Alvin York down there. He is probably the most famous one. They made a movie about his life, Congressional Medal of Honor winner. We lost about 48,000 service personnel, a lot more wounded, so these are deaths, not casualties. Disease claimed 15 of every 1,000 soldiers each year. The British lost, in comparison, 900,000. Right, so you can see we came off light. The French lost 1.4 million, Russians 1.7 million. Right? We lost less than we did in, I don't know, Vietnam was like 68,000 casualties. This was relatively light for us. Again, we didn't do that much fighting. Right? We came in towards the end of it. We also had a lot less. It says financial burden was less. We actually made money off of this war. We spent money on it, obviously, but it helped to grow our industry, and the fact that we were, loaning money to the Allies to buy stuff from us. We actually grew our economy. We go to become the largest, the biggest creditor nation. In other words, more people owe us money than any other country, and it's mostly Europe. It's going to create forgive a lot of that debt over the course of time. We kind of have to, because without it, the German, the French, all those countries, their economies collapse. They end up doing that anyway and going into the Great Depression. But we still made a ton off of it. Now, as soon as this war is over, we're starting at the end of that year to see the outbreak and spread of what's called the Spanish flu. Right? This was the worst pandemic that the world has ever experienced. It only lasts a year, and you could argue the bubonic plague killed more people. This one kills 50 million people estimated in 1 year, one flu season. It's not even a year. The bubonic plague might have killed more people, but it takes 10 years to do it. This one, compared to the coronavirus, it's not even close. It's laughable that the coronavirus is anywhere near this, in all honesty. We had 675 deaths in the U.S. in a little more than that year. So actually, I think our numbers for coronavirus might be higher, but the world scale, much, much different. As it says, oddly, young adults were hit the hardest. More than 43,000 of our servicemen who survived the war end up dying from the flu. And if you've looked, you might have seen, these were popular early on. You might have seen the pictures of, like, that. I think there's a football game being played at Georgia Tech where everyone is they're actually in the stands, but they are all wearing masks. So the let's see if I can pull up some stats here. Right now, we have 608,000 deaths, so we are closing in on that as a country. But if you look at the global, 50 million people died from the flu, and worldwide we have 3.8 million people dying from corona. So that has something to do, I think, with our reactions to coronavirus. Or, you know, it's hard to gauge. You have to go back and do some research to see what kind of things that we did back in 1918, 1919. All right, but this actually ends up being more deadly than the war itself did. The war, it's estimated, again, kills maybe about 20-some million people. And as soon as that's over, you got a pandemic that kills 50 million people. All right. All right. This has a lot of ramifications for us. This was the first time the government really has a concentrated effort to basically shape what you think through propaganda to get you to support the war. It's one of the biggest efforts to curb free speech so that there is no debate over whether or not we should be in the war or how we're handling it. It's a huge, huge explosion of government bureaucracy and by proxy limitations on individual rights during the war itself. And we have, same thing, a lot more of the subjection of state governments to federal powers over the course of this war as well. For us, it cost us over $33 billion, and then with the benefits that we paid to veterans, interest, all that stuff, total really up to about $112 billion. After the war, Americans learned that their Liberty bonds that we basically loaned money so we could fight this war, after 20% value was lost. Taxes went up sharply, right? And that included not just on individuals, but as you can see, excess profits. Largest incomes are paying bills around 77% on their incomes. All right. This was also another change for us. It mentions it here in this last book. It's actually a bigger change than they think now. Through most of our history, we had deflation. Prices declined. And the reason was because of the Industrial Revolution. The whole point of that is that you make stuff more efficiently and cheaper than one guy out here. You can build a chair way cheaper than one guy out here, carving the individual pieces with a knife and then putting them together. So prices were going down, down, down until we got to World War I, and then they start promoting inflation so that they go up. And that's been the norm since, for the most part, since World War I, is that our economy is built on inflation. Basically, we borrow a lot. It's built on credit. So when you borrow money, the only way it works is that you can pay that back. Well, that dollar that you value is only worth 50 cents in the future. So you make $2 for every dollar you did 20 years from now. And that allows you to pay back those debts and spend more money. And our economy has basically been, contingent on inflation going higher and higher, increasing revenues, but also wages keeping pace to some extent so that we can actually pay back credit that we buy. Right. All right. As we mentioned, federal power, much greater. Many of these, businesses basically are just taken over, and the government comes in and say, hey, we need you to make uniforms. You say, well, I've got contracts to do other stuff. Go get some other company. And say, no, we're taking over. We're basically commandeering this place, and you are making uniforms, period. And that's it. Labor basically grows and shrinks at this time. A lot of the unions that were more confrontational and agitating for workers' rights, like the IWW, as you can see, basically put out of business. The ones that are more palatable to the government, who are not going to be as likely to strike and hurt the war effort, or who are going to be radical, those are promoted. You can see their membership actually increases, goes up in the AFL to like 4 million by the 1917. This is something that happens in every war. a lot of people go off to fight if it's a big scale war anyway. And what that means is that there's more job opportunities for people who normally would not have them back home. So a lot of African Americans, men and women, getting jobs in industrial places that usually only hired white people. And then same thing for women, women getting in and filling factory jobs where normally they would just hire men. Right? Now the numbers aren't huge. They are going to be bigger in World War II. And what happens is that most of these, for example, women get these jobs, and then as soon as the war's over, they go back in, get married, or if they were already married, go back and fill a housewife type role. All right. Now, again, to the 20s, one of the things we'll look at is that this does spur a great migration, as it's called. A lot of population moving from the south to the north, mostly African American, but not completely. There's a lot of white people, a lot of white sharecroppers who are fed up with the system, who are also moving north, and a few other places. So you see, for example, northern states growing. Florida's also growing for different reasons there. Right? And basically, look at the rest of us. One of the big victory for any of the progressive movements was that in 1918, Wilson goes out to the Senate, asks to support women's suffrage, says it's vital to the winning of the war. But basically, women, the way we say it is women get the right to vote. That's not true, right? Number one, a lot of women had the right to vote. Wyoming allowed women to vote in all elections back in 1873. So a lot of places women could already vote. So it is not worded that way, and they do that for a reason. Just like no amendment, one that we say gives African Americans the right to vote, does not do so. What it says is that you cannot deny the right to vote because you're a woman or because you're African American. That is different because, doesn't automatically give you as an individual right to vote because you might be a felon. If it just said we give, here's an amendment. Women have the right to vote, then you can't disqualify a woman to vote for any reason. So a woman convicted of a felony could vote. We word it that way, and it seems like a nuance, but it is actually important. All right. And if you don't think it's important, look at all this, the way that they kept African Americans from voting, because the 15th Amendment is that back in the 1860s, we still have, a Voting Rights Act needing to be passed in the 1960s because of all these other things, literacy tests and poll taxes and things like that, you're not stopping African Americans from voting because they're African American. You're stopping them because they can't pay a poll tax. But the effect is it keeps African Americans from voting in huge numbers. All right. This is also going to be setting up the 1920 election, which is the first one in which women can vote in every state for, a presidential as well as congressional elections. All right. Similarly, some people say that is was also put into effect, and that while men were home off fighting and reduced their numbers, that also meant that there was less opposition. They were able to push through the Prohibition Amendment too. But we'll look at that separately when we get to the 20s. All right. Even though this was over, this was not over. We still start turning our attention to Russia because you've got this civil war between these Bolsheviks or the communists and the Mensheviks, or the more in vein of a capitalist, not completely. They're more like the other Europeans that tend to have more socialist elements in their economies than we do. But what we have is a threat of these communists winning. And so we and the other allies are actually pushing stuff out there. We actually are sending troops into Russia in failed efforts to prevent the communists from winning. All right. Now we do have to get the peace. Now, Wilson had 14 points. You can see those listed there. I'm not going to go through all of these individually, but number one, you get treaties openly around that, no secret provisions. Freedom of the seas, equality of trade, self-determination, all that stuff did not happen. All right. Self-determination was basically, Wilson wanted to get rid of colonies and have those transition to independent countries. He wanted the empire the Ottoman and Austrian empires that were on the other side to be broken up and the countries to be organized so that self-determination, the Slavic people can make their own country. That did not happen. You just lumped them all together in Yugoslavia. And the League of Nations. Basically what happened was that Wilson really wanted that League of Nations, and he didn't get any of the other 14 points. That's the only one he got. He sacrificed the rest of it to get the League. His belief was that he would help bring about the other 14 points eventually. The problem was that we were essential to the League, and that's the only thing he pushed for or really got out of this, and then we don't join it. We don't sign this treaty, in fact. Right? Wilson, this is the first for president. He actually goes over and is in the negotiations himself. The first time a president has done that. He directly negotiated the treaty himself in a foreign country, no less. There were some strategic errors here. He didn't take any Republicans with him, and he needed them to get it through the Senate because there was a Senate majority in this Republican majority. That turned a lot of that off and made this partisan when it didn't necessarily have to be, and he might have been more successful without it. Get a couple of high-powered senators over there for advice, and he probably has a much better chance of getting it passed. Right? David Lloyd George of England was their negotiator. Georges Clemenceau of France and Vittorio Orlando. Not very impressed, and they butted heads with the president over most of his demands. Basically, this does a lot to set up World War II, and we know that probably from the way that they punished Germany. That's what gets talked about, but there's a lot more to it that sets up other parts of that war as well. Right? They broke up the empires. Austro-Hungarian Empire now is Austria as a separate country, Hungary as a separate country, Yugoslavia, and then from that and Germany and stuff that we just, used to be part of Russia that they lost during the war, we take part of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, make Czechoslovakia, Finland, all these other little countries. France basically goes in and occupies the western states of Germany for 15 years, military law in there. Italy gets part of what they want. They get the port of Trieste, but they want to land it basically is given over to Yugoslavia. And so they feel slighted, and that's one of those things that's driving the wedge between the Allies and Italy, and then Italy seems like they don't get a fair shake, and they're being pushed towards eventually, going with fascism, and then Mussolini makes that nationalism really a negative thing in their country, right? Note that every decision is made without Russia because they aren't recognized as a country by anyone yet, and they're still in a civil war. They can't really complain about it too much. The big thing, Wilson gives in to the demands for German stuff. Number one, stuff being done to Germans, not by Germans. France especially wants a war clause guilt, which means Germany has to sign this saying the whole World War I was our fault. We started this thing. We were guilty. We were bad. And the French did nothing wrong. Nobody else did anything wrong. It was all us, which was blatantly untrue. And basically looked like it sets up the next thing, which is German reparations, which basically means responsible for it. You said you were guilty for it, so you got to pay for the whole thing. Pretty much the whole German economy was geared towards paying money back towards Britain and France. All right, Wilson gives into that demand. That does more than anything just go on up, and you'll have okay, sorry, I lost the train here. Basically, the Japanese also had that wedge. They were expecting to get more, and they just didn't. And so they felt slighted. And then they start thinking we need to stay out of this world system because we're not going to be treated as equal. There's the added element of they felt that that was racially motivated as well, right? Now, when all this gets home, it doesn't get through because really the main reason is that there's a lot of hostility towards this as well. If we join this league, and that kind of entangles us in European affairs for the future, and we don't want that. Well, the other big thing is that Wilson might have been able to lobby and get this pushed through, but he has a stroke, and he's in bed, practically in a coma for the rest of his administration, and he can't go out and do the work he needs to get it accepted. And what you end up with, again, is basically his wife fulfilling the role of president, because since he's alive, the VP doesn't take over. She's signing paper for him, but he's got to go out and make those public appearances, and it just doesn't happen. So we end up being the ones who do not join the treaty, and that's sets us up for the next time. I'll finish up here. We'll get into the 20s next time, and y'all have a good day, and I will